I love that hat.
Thanks. So do I.
I got.
I don't like baseball at all, but this is a great hat.
I got a new hat today.
Wow. What does that say?
Cabela's Club.
What is
What?
that is very familiar to me. What is it?
It's like a hunting, fishing, outdoor activity giant store built to look like a log cabin with stuffed animals in it. I mean, taxidermied animals in it.
Stuffed animals.
Hey,
It's
stuffed
a-
animals are serious business. My
It's a-
children, I was worried the other day. They were having a discussion. If Jesus were a baby cheetah, would he have stuffies? And I had to run into the room yelling, "No, don't! You'll reignite the schism of 655 in Palermo." And they did not solve that liturgical question.
Beautiful.
All kids are weird.
I'm
feel
just
my kids
picturing
are
this
maybe
place
exceptionally weird.
Full of stuffed animals, like children's stuffed animals.
Hmm.
Hmm.
And you can buy a gun there.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
picturing
it's a plushy hunting lodge.
exactly.
Well, where do you think plushies come from? Canada. They have to be hunted cold.
Beautiful. All right, welcome to episode 1 of the Jaunty Mantis podcast. And our tagline for this podcast is creative questions for curious gamers. And that's kind of our introduction into this space. This is going to be our first aired episode of this podcast. And in true fashion, we have with us our co-host, Jesse. Say hello.
Hello.
And also we have a special guest with us, Rich Ranallo. Rich, you are the originator, designer, creator of a role-playing game called Velvet Generation. So why don't you start off by telling us a little about yourself?
Yeah, Velvet Generation. I'm one of two creators of it. Me and Scott Leeton, my writing partner on it. We originally did an edition of this back in 2002, and it got resurrected in Kickstarter form in 2018. And as with most things in the pandemic, it's very late, but it's just been released recently. I'm just sort of longtime gamer, occasional game designer. I don't know what else there's to say about me in particular, but that's what I'm doing here.
Well, back in the day, Rich used to be a regular at our table. He was a mainstay in our group. Jesse and I, we go way back gaming together, and it's always a pleasure to have Rich at our table. And I really want to say thanks for being on the first episode of the Jaunty Mantis. Jesse, what can we say about the Velvet Generation? What is the overall view of this? I'm not going to make Rich tell us what it's about. What is it from a fan perspective?
Glam rock aliens are a big part of it, and a sinister and very cleverly named governmental organization that suppresses all art and culture. And then Revolution Man, and very disappointed glam rock aliens who arrived on Earth to find that there was no more rock and roll. So they're going to fight the system with a lot of humans. And that is, to me, at least in my perception, a change. I'll get onto that in a minute, but I do want to jump into my first question, if that's okay. Rich, how do I hack this to play in 5e?
Well, I'm probably going to be those rules will be forthcoming. You know, now with the new D&D license and everything, I can finally put it out in the system that I always wanted to see it in, Dungeons and Dragons. You're gonna have a halberd. It's gonna kick ass. It's gonna be great.
Can you get a Glaive de Guisarme or a Beck Corbin, if I'm remembering?
I do want to bring back all of the polearms. Yeah, It's gonna be largely polearm focused.
Are there special rules for a katana?
Yeah. I think, obviously it can cut through, the barrel of a tank.
Perfect.
No armor will last against it. This is really the core of the rock and roll gaming experience, I find, is katanas.
Yeah, my only critique, having been through the book, is that you didn't use the palladium weapons table. No, in all seriousness, I'd just like to ask about the origin. So the original game that this was updated from, I hope that's the right word, was Star Children. And I heard that there's a little bit of an origin story to where Star Children came from.
It was sort of like a lot of things, weirdly, that I've gotten involved in. It was kind of a joke that got out of hand. This was, I think, going back, must have been like starting around like 2001, early days of the RPG.net forums. Me and Scott wanted to kind of do a bit of a troll on there and try to it sounds really quaint right now based on how connected everything is, but we thought we wanted to convince people that we had like gotten a hold of a small press RPG that had basically this concept that was published in the UK, and that it was like this super obscure kind of hipster thing. And we're going to start a thread of people asking people if they've seen it, stuff like that. And, this was back when, like, I don't think, like, if something like that were to exist, it wouldn't be like trivially easy to find it, basically. So it was conceivably something that could still be a joke. It was maybe the last, or conceivably something that could be real, maybe the last time in like internet history where that was the case. And like hardly anyone really bit, because it was actually kind of a dumb idea, considering there were a lot of people on that forum who, it wasn't strictly Americans on the forum, so that might have like worked to in a smaller tight-knit community. But what did happen was a bunch of people were like, well, I know you're lying, but this seems cool, you should make it. So we ended up making it. And I don't know if that thread is still around anywhere, but I kind of hope not, because it's probably really embarrassing.
What was the original impetus behind the concept? Like, what were you envisioning it?
Well, I mean, originally, like as far as the troll post one, it was just going to be like, let's see how many people we can get to believe this obvious bullshit. There's been a few things that we've done like that have been a little bit more successful, but I think we had started kind of kicking around, like sort of talking about like glam rock or like rock opera, like tropes kind of. We had been doing so for a couple years, and like, the concept of like a rock opera type game had vaguely been taking form. And I was like trying to think of like, what is the most, like, if you averaged out every one of these concept albums about rock music being illegal, and just came up with what the like center point of all those was. And this is pretty close to what we landed on. I think it's like the way we were talking about this for a while was like kind of akin to like, the origins of like, the yacht rock series, weirdly parallel to that.
That's really interesting, because you of course had told me that story before, and I just wanted to get it out there for the audience. That game would have really, I feel like, been an outlier in the RPG community at the time. But come back to today, nearly 20 years later, and Velvet Generation just seems like a natural fit for the indie games community. Would you say that you felt, I don't know, I don't know how in touch you were with, the broader aspects of the community while designing, but would you say in working on this one, there were more resources and support available than there were when you were trying to design the original?
Oh, yeah. I mean, resources and support for sure. Yeah. As far as like there being a community at all, I think. I mean, the Forge existed while we were doing this, but I wasn't reading the Forge, and it wasn't really that kind of game anyway. So, that wasn't really gonna be that big of an influence. But like, yeah, it was pretty much just like we designed the first one based on like just stuff we kind of cribbed from other games that we liked, basically. And there wasn't really a place where you could like run ideas by people. The play testing process is like wildly different now. I took some variation of Velvet Generation to the design conference Metatopia like 2 or 3 years, I want to say, starting in the first time I went to Metatopia was 2018, like breaking it down and like being able to run tests and run like small concepts by people, rather than kind of the shot in the dark that you would take, back then was like, you would like mostly design the game, like you would get it mostly complete and then show it to somebody. And by that point, like, it's a little harder to receive feedback and that kind of thing. But, now we've got like internet communities, we've got, real life places, we've got like organizations and stuff. So yeah, there was a ton more support.
With that aspect and connection to community, are there any designers or games you want to shout out who you kind of see, the DNA in your work?
I guess I would say, yeah, like just from my aspect, I mean, most of the parts of this that I wrote had to do with like the game system and the game as a game. Pretty obviously cribbed a fair bit from Greg Stolze's one roll engine in doing that. The core mechanic is like kind of an iteration on that, basically, not close enough to be like officially that system kind of thing. I think a lot of the campaign structure is kind of informed by me at least reading and at some points playing or running a Blades in the Dark campaign. Anyone who's familiar with that game who reads this would probably be able to see like, oh yeah, this was kind of cribbed from there. Those are the two that I can think of that is like the biggest like influence like on the game itself. But yeah, in terms of just like community and having people, having like a deep well of cool ideas and best practices to pick from. Like I said, the Metatopia community has been great. I've been a member of the Indie Game Developer Network since 2018, I want to say. And that's been a hugely supportive community there as well, even if I'm not like picking specific things from specific brains.
Yeah, I remember, was it a community event, the end of the Kickstarter, the live stream?
Yeah, that was
let me cut you off. There was a live stream at the end of the Kickstarter that you could watch people in a very noisy, crowded public place all testing and playing games while the Kickstarter ticked over, and it was really exciting to watch it make the funding goal at the last minute.
Yeah, that was wild. It's a community that I haven't really gotten back in touch with like since the start of the pandemic, and I kind of just found out about that as a fluke. It was at a bar / liquor store called the Beer Temple in Chicago 1 or 2 days before the Kickstarter campaign was going to officially end. And yeah, it was just like I found out about this thing and people were bringing demos of games that they were working on or whatever. And it was kind of like, it was weirdly like auspicious because I had set up 2 short demos where I would like run people through a few scenes. And I asked people if it was okay if I live streamed it. And they said, yeah. It was a very hasty setup. if you were watching that at all. Yeah. In the middle of the second demo is when we basically hit our fundraising goal. But the other funny thing about that is at the point that I left my office to go there, I didn't think we were going to hit the goal at all. We were actually like considerably far behind our target. And I was like, this might not work, but I can't remember who or what it was, but like during the time I was in a cab ride from my office to the place where we were running this thing, someone on like some fairly big name person on Twitter like retweeted one of the links to the thing. I cannot place who exactly it was, but it just happened to like get a retweet from the right person or something like that. And like in the time that it took me to get over this place, we had like gone up like $2,500 on the Kickstarter goal, and all of a sudden it looked like it was actually gonna, happen. And then it happened in the middle of that game session. So turned out to like, work out really well as a like capstone on the whole thing. But yeah, that's one of those like sort of live in-person game communities that like I haven't seen very much of since the pandemic started.
I feel like in general, the gaming community may be more risk averse to the pandemic than possible, which has probably made events chaotic longer than they may be in other communities or scenes. And like that's just mentioned as an observation. That's not a commentary or judgment call. People, need to take care of themselves and their friends and families the best way they know how.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that. I mean, in-person conventions have mostly come back. There's still probably a higher rate of people taking precautions there than at almost anything else I go to. But I do know of a decent sized, I could tick off a few examples of like things that were live in-person events before the pandemic started that like still haven't fully come back. And yeah, like, you make you make the choices that are right for you. Yeah. I just went back to Origins for the first time since 2019, and I think it's estimated they're at like 60% of the attendance that they were before the pandemic started. This is the first year that's like not been shitty there. It was a great time, but yeah.
Yeah, I got to the first Gen Con post COVID lockdowns, and it was a bizarre, surreal experience, but I wound up having fun. If you drink enough, that Gen Con themed beer, things are great.
Sure.
Yeah, I would have thought, I was conflicted on it, right? Because I thought we knew, our community knew what Con Crud was before anybody else, so I thought on one hand, we're prepared for this. And then on the other hand, we're the most susceptible group for it in a lot of cases. So I didn't know how that was going to play out. So I'm excited to hear it sounds like somewhat returning to normal.
Well, and that's like the weird silver lining that I've heard from like everybody is saying like, oh, it turns out when I wear a mask to a convention to stop getting COVID, I also just don't feel shitty afterward because like I don't catch whatever unnamed virus happened to be going around. Like, so it's it's an extra added incentive.
Yeah, for sure. I travel a lot for work. I still wear a mask on an airplane. And occasionally I will get somebody who'll be like, oh, you don't have to wear that anymore. COVID's over. And I'm like, oh, I'm not wearing this for COVID. They're like, why are you wearing it? I'm like, I just don't want to get sick. Like I don't want the common cold. Like
I went 2 years without getting a cold. After the pandemic started, I got COVID twice in that time, but I never got a cold. I never got anything else. So, something's working.
Well, when you have two little kids at home, lockdown is no protection against norovirus. Let me tell you, that stuff just, there's no avoiding it. So I got to spend some time with the book recently to prep for this. And where did the action grid come from? Because I love that as a concept. Can you explain what the action grid is? Sorry.
Okay.
For those at home who may not have a chance to look at the book.
I am going to try to explain it in words. It's definitely a thing that like you want to like look at. But it's so the sort of like attributes or the, whatever the scores of the game called action scores. They're on the character sheet in a grid, right? And this basically determines like how many dice do you roll for every single thing you're going to do in the game. They're in this sort of like grid shape. There's on the left-hand side of this square grid are 5 verbs, which are evade, perceive, pose, perform, and organize. And that's like, the half of what you're doing. That's like the action. And then across the top is 5, put a pin in it, or 6, sort of nouns, which is like, so it's like you're diagramming a sentence basically. And those are like music, violence, tech, authority, and minds. And then for the Star Children, for the alien characters in the game, there's mojo, which is the 6th little column. And visually, these make this like sort of a grid of dots that is roughly designed to look like a chord chart on if on like a guitar tablature. And that's sort of how you derive your scores. What happens is you have a certain number of dots that you're allowed to fill in this little grid. And then the scores of each of these, the 5 things on the left and the 6 things on the top, are the number of dots that are filled in that row or column. What it basically means is every choice you're making when you're filling this little bit in is going to increase 2 of the scores, because you're filling in a point that's at the intersection of one of these rows or columns. The sort of intent behind that actually comes from that same group I was doing that live stream with. I ran a shorter playtest. But like what it essentially means is that if you really want to get good at like one particular thing, if you wanted to like really focus yourself on, like, there was one guy in this playtest group when we were playtesting character creation who was like, I am just going to try to make the character who is the best at violence I can possibly make. Right. Good playtest, case study. So he's like, okay, I've filled in the dot at the intersection of perform and violence, because that's what I use when I hit somebody. That's what I really want to be able to do. I want to be able to perform violence. Like, okay, that increases your perform score and your violence score. If you want to increase your violence score one more again, you do like, let's do evade violence. So I'm also good at like dodging and running away if I want to. And he got through like all the dots except the dot for like organized violence, right? So he's like, well, what does it mean if I fill in this dot? Like, well, it's going to increase your violence score, obviously. And it's going to increase your organized violence. He's like, well, what is organized violence? And I said, well, that's like, if you wanted to start a riot or do like terrorism, he's like, so if I want to get better at punching people, if I want to like get that last little bit of like good at punching people, I'm also making myself a better terrorist. And I said, yes, you've figured it out. And it was this concept that sort of, I think reflects the theme of the game. The sort of central question is like, when you specialize in this or this or this, like, what are you actually doing? And sometimes you might end up in a situation where you're like, well, the most effective course of action I can take here is something that might be a little dubious, let's say. And that's sort of reflected in a few different choices all throughout the book. That is a verbal description of something that really only makes sense if you look at it. But hopefully it made some kind of sense there. As far as like, the origins of that is like, it sort of started with Blades in the Dark. If you're familiar with Blades in the Dark, you have these like groupings of scores, groupings of like 3 things, where if you, in the case of Blades in the Dark, you'll have like 3 or 4 scores that are in a group that go from like 0 to 4, basically, right? And you don't have to have a score in any of them. So those are the things you're rolling to do, but out of that group, your score for like the overall ability is the number of ones you have a first dot in, right? So
I didn't even recognize that until you said it out loud. But like, yeah, that's great. The intersection of these, like that question, what does it mean to organize violence? That's the point in my read through of the mechanics where I was like, I know some pretty clever people. Like,
yeah, right. That was the I spent a lot of time in the design process, like really frustrated on like what the scores are going to be in this game, and like how like the concept of like you're rolling a bunch of dice and you do all this stuff was established long before like what dice do you roll kind of thing. And I was basically like looking at how this Blades in the Dark thing was, and I'm like, well, what if the first row meant something, but also the second row meant something, and the third row meant something, and you weren't filling them all into the line, and it sort of clicked into place from that.
How long did you have to spend on the wording for it? Because one of the things that I think is really great if you're reading through the rule book is there's an example of each one, because it's basically like 25 things. And what I loved about this is, like, this is back in the day when I used to sing praises of White Wolf systems before, when I had only actually played about 2 RPGs. Had a bunch, but only played 2. I was like, oh, the flexibility of pairing any attribute with any ability. And then you're like, and what does bureaucracy do again? How are you going to roll strength bureaucracy? And I feel like you've pared it down in a pretty elegant way. So how many hours did you spend tuning that language?
I don't know how many, but it was a lot, I would say. Like the concept of having that as a grid was one thing, and then figuring out like what things went where, and like I knew I wanted to be like 5x5 plus the extra one for the aliens, right? And also like I will note the fact that because of that structure, the regular dice, the regular maximum number of dice you can roll is 10, but if you're an alien, it goes to 11. The Spinal Tap reference was not remotely intentional, but once I saw it, I absolutely was not going to get rid of it, basically.
I remember from discussions in the Discord during the Kickstarter and earlier, I haven't got to read every word of the text. I'll just admit it.
It's a lengthy book.
Did the Nick's Buckingham rule make it in?
I realized after we published it that it did not. Oh. And that's the one, there's always something about every like published thing that like you sort of kick yourself at over. And that's the one for me. Though there's generally speaking, there was the category of stuff that got taken out of the book in the development process. The category, the one type of rule or whatever that got taken out the most was there was a whole bunch of stuff on like internal band, like strife and discord, that didn't really make a ton of sense when your band has this like external threat to worry about. But I kind of want to just compile it all in one place and publish it as like a 2-page like mini supplement. Like if you really want to do hardcore like VH1 behind the music, like focus on your band like loving and hating each other, this is your little like core add-on kind of thing. And it's going to go in there if that really happens, because I think that's like an integral part of rock and roll stories that maybe would get missed out if you were like, you have this like, this ever-present threat against you. You might gloss over those things. So yeah, the Nick's Buckingham rule sadly did not end up there.
Speaking of other aspects of game design, there's something I wanted to ask you about, because the world is different between not only just when this started in its origins and when the first version of the game was created. It's a much different world now. What is it like to have like a sensitivity reader and design a game that's for different groups of people? Whereas maybe back, I don't want to speak for y'all, but back in the day with the original versions of the game, I'm sure those things, weren't fathomable at that point.
Yeah, it's there was a lot to take in there. But yeah, like when the 2002 book came out, like there were maybe 3 sets of eyes on the whole text, from beginning to end. And it like we didn't do that step of it. It was just sort of like, you published a book, whatever. This time around, one of the first things we did was sort of like look at the original book and like think about like, what is the stuff that's maybe like outside our frame of reference necessarily, and one of the things in my frame of reference that I looked at, and I was like, okay, this is a game. It's very glam rock themed. It's very, it deals with androgyny, it deals with gender in kind of weird ways, I would say. And I sort of felt like, kind of paging through the 2002 edition, I'm like, did we make it a little too much, where like it looks as if like being gender nonconforming is something that only aliens do, basically, is like one thing, because there's a lot of digression about like, well, the Star Children, didn't really have they have no such thing as a biological sex. They didn't really have any concept of gender until they discovered Earth, and the idea that they had of gender from us was skewed because they were looking at TV in the first place, but like specifically like glam rock musicians and whatnot. So I was like, maybe that wasn't done super great. Apparently, I think fortunately a lot of people who know a little bit more than I did disagreed with that and thought it was handled quite well. So I'm like, great, cool. But this time around, yeah, we wanted to bring on sensitivity readers, cultural consultants. I don't remember what exactly they're credited as in the book, so I don't have it on hand right now. But it was to deal with like two specific, specifically this, the issue of gender, make sure that we're like presenting that well. And also the concept of like, me and Scott being like two white people from the suburbs talking about the history of rock music. There's a lot there. And like, especially if you're talking about rock music as this like utopian ideal that these characters are striving for, it's worth mentioning that like, the rock scene wasn't exactly 100% great for everyone involved in it. Particularly not necessarily for the people who originated the rock music scene. So yeah, we specifically sought out sensitivity readers on like those topics in particular, but also when you bring someone on like this, they will bring to light other things. It's like, it's honestly really great to have like just someone else whose job it is to read the book and tell you what they think. Honestly, some of the issues that came up in this like weren't necessarily what we like set the sensitivity readers out to do. One of them in particular, sorry, this is maybe a little bit of a digression, but like the two revolutionary factions that are in the story, which are kind of like meant to be the two approaches you can take to your revolution, either like a more touchy-feely hearts and minds kind of thing embodied in Velvet, or the more like direct action, hardcore, often more violent group, which in the original book was called the Blue Army. And one of our sensitivity readers said like, hey, this isn't really like in the wheelhouse of what I'm talking about, but since you described this group as the Blue Army, and like, there might be people out there who, at this point affiliate the blue with like Thin Blue Line, or like, affiliate the color, literally just the name of the color blue with the police, right? We're like, well, that's not really like something that like you have to like, we weren't like, oh, this has to change. This is like bad. This is offensive. This anything like that. But what it did do is it kicked us off like thinking about it and just being like, well, if we were going to change it, what would we do? And we just started looking at like synonyms for blue. So we ended up changing the name of it to the Cobalt Army, mainly because that just sounds a lot cooler. So
I remember that was one of the things I don't know if we had discussed it or if it was something that came up in the Discord, where I had over the pandemic, and everything, the increasing, like recognizing the core of boomer in me to my shame after my initial knee-jerk reaction, because when that one was mentioned, I was like, oh, come on. And then I got to the point of like, how much does it cost to just make more people feel comfortable with this. Like nothing. It costs nothing to say to more people, hey, you're welcome to be here and you can have a good time.
Right. And like,
I'm
and
glad
if
I got there because so many people stop at the come on.
Right, exactly. And it's like I would maybe feel a little more trepidatious about that if I thought that like if it was like near and dear to my heart. The other thing that the sensitivity reader pointed out is that when they Googled Blue Army, they found out that I didn't even know this, that this was like a name for like Aerosmith's fan base. And I was kind of like,
Interesting.
I don't need.
It actually kind of works. I mean, it's.
I don't want to tie
Revolution
myself
X.
too closely to Aerosmith here, so we're gonna tweak that. And like, yeah, and like I said, this was a change that came out of the sensitivity reading process, but was not necessarily like a sensitivity reading thing. I don't think anyone would have read this and been like offended or mad or anything, but this was almost more generational than anything else. Someone being like, well, here's, what people of a certain age might be thinking that name. They're not gonna confuse it based on the text in the book. They're not gonna think these guys are allied with the police. There's actually maybe the name of the Star Children's sort of otherworldly powers being mojo is like maybe something that's a little bit more in line with something that like is a valid sensitivity reading topic, because that's a word a lot of people are familiar with through like the context of rock music, mojo, rise, and all that stuff. It's also like a real world religious terminology, having to do with like voodoo and related sort of syncretic faiths, largely which grew up during the time of slavery. And I had this like this a little bit of a like moment where before sending it to the sensitivity reader, I'm like, should I change this before sending it out? Because I'm a little on the fence about it, about how this could be seen as trivializing whatever. The RPGs have a ton of like magic powers that are like someone's real religion, right? This is like an endemic thing in more games than any of us can count. But then I'm like, well, no, that's what a sensitivity reader is for, right? I'm just gonna like if I couldn't send this to somebody, then I shouldn't be trusting them to be a sensitivity reader. And it was a good thing too, because what this reader came back with as the advice was essentially like all this context of the religious and whatnot. But instead of saying like, oh, you got to change this is bad, or, you shouldn't be talking about this, which like the idea that like you shouldn't be talking about something is fraught at best, in my opinion. What they did was they said, well, can you add something about the characters in the game being aware of this term having this other meaning, and like how that informs what they do about it, And they were like, well, during slavery, like even just following these religious practices was itself an act of rebellion. And it was a thing that united communities against the oppression that they had. So as a result, we sort of just like wrote into it that like, the Star Children came down here with this opinion of this terminology just from the rock music they'd received, just like a lot of people reading the book might have that same impression. But that once they got here, they gained a new understanding of it, and that they saw the commonality here. It sort of becomes an in-game sort of parallel.
I want to say, in a game about revolution against oppressive authorities who are here to crush your culture, literally putting your money where your mouth is to make sure that, people who may be victims of similar oppression in the real world feel comfortable playing the game is a pretty decent thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the, you know, the paradox of doing it. It sort of goes hand in hand with the paradox of doing any kind of dystopian sci-fi right now, where like sometimes even saying that there's a dystopia 50 years in the future is a bit optimistic. It can feel. But there's also there's the like, you know, one person's dystopia is like another person's day-to-day life kind of thing. And I don't think that means you should stop telling stories like that. Which is what some people either feel, or like it's the sort of end logic of sort of discourse on things like that. But like, no, you just have to you have to be aware of those things, right? Like,
yeah. I think that's a common problem amongst white creators in many different fields, where they feel like they should just be hands off and not touch a particular issue. You know, in the writing sphere, I've heard from some white writers who are like, well, I don't talk about Black issues or Black characters in my stories because that I don't know about that. I'm a white kid from the suburbs. I don't have any familiarity with that. And honestly, I feel like that's a huge cop out. And if you should at least try, right? And I think that's one of the most commendable things about having a sensitivity reader and making that effort with your game or with any work of creativity is like, we can't just come to a screeching halt. Like, we have to keep trying to do the right thing, even if we fail along the way. So I think you're to be commended by that, because I think, you know, a lot of people wouldn't have touched those particular issues in a game or in a work of creativity. So I'm there with you.
Yeah, there's in Chris Spivey's Harlem Unbound. I read this in the first edition. I assume there's something similar in the second edition, which is essentially, you know, the Call of Cthulhu Lovecraft mythology, but set in 1919 Harlem instead of 1919 New England. You know, written by Chris Spivey, who's a Black man who has this section in there essentially as a message, not directly to the white players of this game, but like it touches on this, like, you know, specifically telling you that like this is a game about the sort of like Harlem Renaissance Black experience with this touch of Lovecraft mythos, which are like two ideas that go wonderfully together, and as a bonus would make Lovecraft himself spit in his grave, which is great. Right. It is very specifically being like if your take on a bunch of these things is that you as like a white player or someone who is not experiencing some type of marginalization, whatever it happens to be about, is that like you should never deal with it. You're going to end up with something that's far worse, right? And that like you should try to deal with these issues that are not your personal experience maturely and responsibly, and it's a good excuse to learn shit you wouldn't have learned before. But you're that like if you're a group of if you're like, you know, a group of mostly white gamers who picks up a copy of Harlem Unbound, you shouldn't pick it up and be like, okay, how do I play white people in this? Because right. Good Lord, you've just absolutely missed the point. I'm not stating that as well as he did, but that was a thing that I read that was like, it took the edge off some of the concerns I might otherwise have had.
Have you read Coyote and Crow?
I haven't yet, no.
There's a really great section that I really appreciate, because that was one that I was like, I don't think I get to play this one, but I'm going to throw money at them anyway, because awesome what they're doing. And then I got the book and I looked at it, and there's a whole section that I think was phrased a little bit more politely, but, you know, I wouldn't have been mad if it was like, hey, colonizer. If you're a white person playing this, you're totally welcome to. Don't use a real tribe. don't try to have an accent. Don't call yourself Two-Spirit. You're not. But yeah, make up your own tribe and have fun. Just, don't be a dick. And I really appreciated that, because that invitation, like, and again, before someone hears this, I am totally fine with there being spaces that are not for me. I feel like there's a number of spaces that are. Maybe I don't need to have everything.
The counterexample of that I can think of is like a game like Bluebeard's Bride, which is a game that has a lot of domestic abuse, a lot of sexual abuse, like themes to it. There is stuff in there that, like, as a dude, like, I'm probably never going to run a game of Bluebeard's Bride. I can look at the book. I can think this is great. I don't think that's the same thing as, like, I can't possibly play a Black World War I vet who comes back home, is thrown into the middle of like a racialized massacre, and there's also Cthulhu there. Like, those are two different scales of things. I'm just like, I'm not going to play a game about domestic abuse. That's like the core theme.
Yeah, I threw money at hashtag feminism, but if I never play Her Last Text, like, I think I'm going to be okay.
Right.
So let's talk about, because the huge number of new gamers that we have now is because of 5e D&D, and I had Jesse give a little bit of a synopsis of the game at the beginning. And if there is a new generation coming in specifically from Dungeons and Dragons, and maybe we can close on this if Jesse doesn't have anything else. But how would we pitch, Rich? How would you pitch Velvet Generation to those 5e gamers? They love D&D. They're curious for more, because that was, I don't want to speak for everybody on this call, but that was me at some point. All I knew was D&D, and then I got to be curious about what else is out there. So this is your moment to pitch Velvet Generation to people who are curious about it.
I honestly think there is like kind of a big D&D parallel, because of the zero to hero kind of thing. Like, you start out as a little garage band, nobody knows who you are, you're weak, you don't have a lot of resources, but you gain in fame and you gain power, like you literally level up in the game, right? So it's more like a game like D&D than I would say a lot of sort of indie RPGs. But this idea that, like, you're fighting this nebulous authority concept is like maybe the major like turning point to like the type of story that it is. Ideally, in Velvet Generation, you are playing this group of heroes, but you are part of a much larger community. And that you go from being unknown to being leaders in this like massive global revolutionary movement, but that movement would not be anything without the movement itself. One rock band is not going to overthrow the government all by themselves. And I think that sometimes that's the kind of, it sort of makes concretes the kind of things that like people often end up doing in like a D&D type campaign anyway. Like, you end up having these recurring NPCs because you like it when the DM does that particular funny voice. So this just like makes that more concrete.
Right on. All right. Well, Jesse, do you have anything else you want to ask our guests before we sign off?
Yeah, Rich. If people are out there and wanting to get a copy of Velvet Generation, how do they do so?
Well, the number one thing they could do is they can go to their local game store, and if they see it on the shelf, they can buy it, or they can order it. It is in distribution, so most game stores can get it. If you're not lucky enough to have, one or several game stores readily available to you, you can search for Velvet Generation on Drive-Thru RPG. You can get print copies there. You can get PDF copies there. There's a starter scenario that's pay what you want. That's basically what I've been running at conventions for a couple of years now. There's a website, velvetgeneration.com. On Twitter, velvet_GEN. I just made a Blue Sky account, but it's Velvet Generation, all one word in Blue Sky. I don't know anything about Blue Sky. I don't know if I'm going to post much there or anything like that. But those are basically how you can find it.
All right. Thanks. And Jesse, where can people find more information about you and the Jaunty Mantis online?
Well, Rich mentioned being on Blue Sky. I don't. At the time we're recording, Twitter did a thing pretty recently that again, Twitter did a thing again. So that'll be vague to history. But yeah, I'm at Jingoist Fett on Twitter, and we are at Jaunty Mantis on Twitter. There's nothing there. Do not seek us. Like the motto of the 51st state, Ho-Huck. Do not seek us.
Pure professionalism here, Rich, as you can tell.
We are solid at this trade.
The goal, I feel like, with any podcast is to get to the point where the people listening demand that you leave all that shit in, because they're just so weirdly parasocially attached to you.
Correct.
But when you start out, you actually do have to cut it out.
All right. Okay, and for Jesse, Rich, and myself, I'm going to fire off our famous catchphrase, which is get out there and play some fucking games.
That's how we were supposed to close the episode. We done fucked up. Creative questions for curious gamers.
Get out there and play those games.
Yeah, go play some games or shit. I don't know.
All right, they're great.
Go play Velvet Generation.